She asked for help. He refused. You won't believe what happened next. Courtroom, emotional moment. She stood before the judge, a tremor in her voice, as the secret she'd guarded for years threatened to shatter her world. One desperate plea, one cold refusal, and now, the consequences were playing out in a way no one could have predicted. After listening to the whole story, you will definitely share your opinion in the comments. So let's move towards the story. The rain lashed against the courtroom windows, mirroring the storm brewing within Amelia. Every drop seemed to amplify the silence that followed the prosecutor's damning summation. Her gaze drifted to the man at the defense table, his face a mask of carefully constructed indifference. David. The name felt like a phantom limb, an ache she'd learned to live with but never truly healed from. She remembered a different David, a younger, less jaded version, before life, or perhaps his own choices, had carved such deep lines of cynicism into his features. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, each person present a silent observer of a tragedy unfolding, a drama spun from threads of desperation and the unyielding grip of circumstance. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a reckoning, a collision of past and present, where a single, pivotal moment of refusal had set an irreversible chain of events in motion. Amelia's mind drifted back to that winter night, a decade ago, when the first whispers of trouble had begun. The world had seemed a different place then, less harsh, less unforgiving. She was a young mother, struggling, yes, but clinging to the hope that things would eventually turn. Her son, Ethan, was barely 5, a vibrant, curious boy whose laughter was the only sunlight in her often clouded days. They lived in a small, rented house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, and the heating bill was a constant source of dread. David, then, was a rising star in the local business community, a man whose ambition was as palpable as the expensive cologne he wore. They had shared a history, a brief, passionate chapter from their college days that had ended amicably, or so she'd thought. He was the only person she could think of, the only thread of hope she dared to grasp, when the medical bills for Ethan began to pile up, threatening to engulf them. Ethan's rare condition, a cruel twist of fate, demanded constant, expensive care, a financial burden that quickly became insurmountable for a single mother working 2 minimum-wage jobs. She remembered the humiliation of that phone call, the way her voice had trembled as she swallowed her pride and laid bare her vulnerability. The desperation was a raw, exposed nerve, a feeling she still tasted in her mouth. She had explained Ethan's situation, the escalating costs, the fear that gnawed at her heart. She hadn't asked for a handout, not really. She'd simply sought a loan, a temporary lifeline, promising to repay every penny, with interest, as soon as she was able. She'd even offered collateral, what little she had, anything to prove her sincerity. But David's response had been cold, clinical, devoid of the warmth she'd once known. He'd cited company policy, the risks, the strictures of his newfound corporate image. His words, delivered with a chilling detachment, had felt like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, Amelia," he'd said, his voice flat, "but I can't help you. It's simply not good business." The line had gone dead, leaving her in a silence far louder than any scream. That refusal, delivered with such dispassionate finality, had been the precipice from which her life had truly begun to spiral. It was a moment etched into her memory, a turning point where a path of desperate choices had begun to unfold, each step leading inexorably to this very courtroom. The sheer weight of that refusal, the casual indifference of it, had crushed something vital within her, leaving her feeling utterly alone, utterly abandoned, in a world that suddenly seemed to have no room for compassion. She had walked away from that phone call not just without the money she needed, but with a profound sense of betrayal, a feeling that the last vestige of human connection she had with him had been severed. It was a wound that festered, slowly but surely, until it became a part of who she was, a quiet bitterness that simmered beneath the surface of her daily struggles. The memory of his voice, devoid of empathy, still echoed in her ears, a chilling reminder of the chasm that separated their lives. The courtroom hummed with the low murmur of anticipation, a stark contrast to the deafening silence that had followed David's refusal all those years ago. Amelia's gaze was still fixed on him, a silent question hanging in the air between them. Did he remember that night? Did he ever truly grasp the weight of his words, the domino effect they'd unleashed? She doubted it. People like David, she'd learned, rarely looked back, their lives a constant forward march, unburdened by the collateral damage they left in their wake. Her own life, however, had been defined by that moment, a slow descent into a reality she'd never envisioned. The medical bills hadn't stopped coming. In fact, they'd escalated. Ethan's condition, while manageable with consistent treatment, was relentless. Amelia had tried everything. She'd worked extra shifts until exhaustion was a physical ache in her bones. She'd sold what few valuables she possessed, each item a small piece of her past evaporating into the harsh light of her present. She'd swallowed her pride countless times, approaching charities, friends, even distant relatives, only to be met with sympathetic sighs and empty hands. The world, it seemed, was only willing to offer pity, not practical help. The memory of Ethan's innocent, trusting eyes burned into her consciousness. He deserved more than the constant anxiety that permeated their small home, more than the fear she fought so hard to conceal. He deserved a chance at a normal life, a future unmarred by the shadow of his illness. That conviction, fierce and unyielding, was the engine that drove her, pushing her to consider options she would have once dismissed as unthinkable. Desperation, she discovered, was a powerful sculptor, capable of reshaping a person's moral landscape, blurring the lines between right and wrong. It was a gradual erosion, not a sudden collapse. First, it was borrowing from her future paychecks, then from small, predatory lenders whose interest rates were a second, silent disease. Each step deeper into the financial quicksand brought with it a gnawing sense of unease, a constant whisper of judgment in the back of her mind. But the alternative, the thought of Ethan's suffering, of being unable to provide the care he needed, was a far greater torment. Then came the opportunity, cloaked in the guise of a solution. It wasn't an offer she sought out. It found her, whispered through hushed tones in a place where desperation gathered. A chance to make quick money, significant money, enough to cover Ethan's treatments for months, perhaps even a year. The details were vague at first, obscured by the promise of immediate relief, a light at the end of a very long, very dark tunnel. It involved an illicit operation, a network of individuals moving goods across borders. The risks were immense, she knew that. The potential consequences were terrifying. But the image of Ethan, pale and listless in a hospital bed, eclipsed every fear. She remembered the suffocating weight of powerlessness, the feeling that she was failing her child. That feeling, more than any external pressure, drove her to make a choice that would forever alter the trajectory of her life. It was a single, irreversible decision, born from a mother's fierce, desperate love, a choice made in the shadow of a cold refusal that had left her with no other perceived options. And as she now sat in the courtroom, watching David, she couldn't help but wonder if, in his comfortable, successful life, he ever considered the lives he inadvertently shaped with his good business decisions. The silence of the courtroom now felt different, weighted with the unspoken narratives of all who had been broken, all who had been pushed to the edge by the indifferent turning of a blind eye. The courtroom began to stir, a subtle shift in posture, a rustle of papers, as if the collective consciousness of those present sensed the narrative drawing closer to its inevitable, painful climax. Amelia felt the weight of every gaze, every unspoken question, but her eyes remained fixed on David, whose legal team now presented his impeccable alibi, a meticulously constructed shield of business meetings and international travel. He was a man of consequence, a pillar of the community, and his defense was built on the unshakable foundation of his perceived respectability. Yet, beneath the polished veneer, Amelia saw the flicker of something else, a fleeting moment of discomfort in his eyes when her name was mentioned, a tiny crack in his carefully constructed facade. Did he remember? The question gnawed at her, a persistent echo from a past he so clearly wished to erase. The first few runs had been terrifying, exhilarating in their sheer audacity. The adrenaline had masked the fear, the desperation a powerful anesthetic against the gnawing guilt. Each successful delivery meant another month of Ethan's medication, another consultation with a specialist, a fleeting sense of stability in a life that had become a constant tightrope walk. She'd learned to compartmentalize, to separate the Amelia who was a loving mother from the Amelia who moved in the shadows, making choices she abhorred but deemed necessary. The money, when it came, felt tainted, yet its necessity was undeniable. It bought Ethan time. It bought him comfort. It bought her a temporary reprieve from the relentless anxiety that had become her constant companion. She saw his small improvements, the way his laughter slowly returned, the light in his eyes that had dimmed during their darkest days. And in those moments, a fragile justification took root. She was doing this for him. But the world of illicit operations is a treacherous one, built on shifting sands of trust and betrayal. The whispers started first, then the pointed questions, the subtle shifts in alliances within the network. A new face appeared, a colder, more ruthless presence, and the terms of their involvement changed, the risks escalating with every new demand. Amelia found herself deeper than she ever intended, caught in a web she couldn't untangle. The escape she'd envisioned, the moment she could walk away with enough saved for Ethan, seemed to recede further with each passing day. The stakes became higher, the fear more visceral. She was no longer just a desperate mother. She was a cog in a dangerous machine, vulnerable and exposed. She remembered one particularly harrowing night, a border crossing fraught with tension, the air thick with unspoken threats. She'd seen faces hardened by violence, eyes that held no compassion. It was then, amidst the fear and the certainty of impending danger, that the full weight of her choices crashed down upon her. She was risking everything, not just her freedom, but her very life, and the thought of Ethan being left alone, without her, was a torment more profound than any fear for herself. That night, she understood the true cost of David's refusal, the path it had forced her down. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about survival, about navigating a labyrinth of moral compromises that had begun with a simple, desperate plea for help, a plea that had been met with a resounding, chilling silence. The courtroom was a crucible, forging the past into a present reality, each legal maneuver a hammer blow on the anvil of Amelia's fate. The prosecutor, a sharp, unyielding woman, now presented the evidence, layer by damning layer, painting a picture of Amelia as a calculating participant in a criminal enterprise. Documents, intercepted communications, and even a carefully blurred surveillance photo, all flashed across the large screen, each piece a thread tightening around Amelia. Her heart ached, not just for herself, but for Ethan, for the judgment that would inevitably fall upon him, too, through no fault of his own. She saw David's gaze flicker to the screen, a fleeting moment of something akin to recognition, or perhaps just morbid curiosity. He remained outwardly composed, his expression unreadable, a testament to years of cultivating an impenetrable exterior. The night of the raid was a blur of flashing lights and shouts. She remembered the cold metal of handcuffs, the jarring sensation of her world collapsing around her. The frantic thoughts that tumbled through her mind were all of Ethan. Who would care for him? How would he understand? The officers, though professional, offered no comfort, only the stark reality of her situation. She was just another face in a long line of those caught in the unforgiving machinery of justice. The subsequent interrogations were grueling, endless cycles of questions, accusations, and the suffocating weight of her own guilt. She had tried to explain, to articulate the impossible choices, the desperate circumstances that had led her down this path. But how do you quantify desperation to someone who has never felt it? How do you explain the unique terror of watching your child suffer, knowing you are powerless to stop it? Her words, when she spoke them, felt hollow, insufficient, swallowed by the sterile air of the interrogation room. She hadn't named names, not initially. The code of silence, a strange, twisted loyalty forged in shared peril, had held firm for a time. But as the pressure mounted, as the reality of a lengthy prison sentence loomed, a new kind of fear began to assert itself. The fear of being truly separated from Ethan, perhaps for years. It was then, facing a future without him, that she had made the agonizing decision to cooperate, to provide the information that ultimately led to the dismantling of the network and the indictment of its key players. Among them, though not directly involved in the illicit trade itself, were individuals whose corporate connections and financial dealings had provided the infrastructure, the legitimate facade, for the operation. And as the investigation had deepened, as the financial trails had been meticulously followed, a name had surfaced, a ghost from her past, a name inextricably linked to a pivotal moment of refusal, David. not as a direct participant in the illegal activities, but as someone whose financial oversight and, critically, his unyielding refusal of a simple, desperate plea had created the vacuum into which her choices had been forced. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but his hand, in its cold detachment, had set the gun in motion. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. His carefully cultivated image of success had, in a strange and convoluted way, contributed to her downfall. The courtroom now felt less like a place of justice and more like a stage for an intricate, heartbreaking play where the audience watched, mesmerized, as the tangled threads of kindness withheld and desperation unleashed finally, irrevocably, came undone. The courtroom was a crucible, the air thick with unspoken accusations and the palpable tension of a life hanging in the balance. The prosecutor's final argument, cold and clinical, dissected Amelia's choices, portraying them as calculated acts of criminality rather than desperate measures. Amelia felt a profound weariness settle over her, a deep exhaustion that went beyond the physical. She watched David, who now sat with an almost imperceptible stiffness, his gaze occasionally drifting towards her, a flicker of something unidentifiable in his eyes. Was it guilt, recognition, or merely the uncomfortable awareness of being implicated, however indirectly, in a very public downfall? She couldn't tell, and at this point, she wasn't sure it mattered. His empathy, if it existed, had come far too late. Her own lawyer, a kind but pragmatic woman, had done her best, painting a picture of Amelia as a victim of circumstance, a mother driven to extremes by an insurmountable financial burden and a system that offered no safety net. She spoke of Ethan, of his illness, of the mountains of medical bills, and the cold refusal from the man who now sat across the aisle. But in the eyes of the law, intent and motive sometimes blurred, and the lines of right and wrong, when drawn in black and white, left little room for the desperate shades of gray. Amelia had taken responsibility for her actions, not shirking from the fact that she had broken the law. But she also believed, with every fiber of her being, that the seed of her desperation had been planted that winter night, a decade ago, when a hand of assistance had been so coldly withdrawn. The weight of the verdict was now imminent, a tangible presence in the room. Amelia closed her eyes for a brief moment, and in that fleeting darkness, she saw Ethan's face, his bright, innocent smile. This was for him. Every struggle, every difficult choice, every tear shed in secret had been for him. And now, she faced the consequences, not just for herself, but for the ripple effect her actions would have on his young life. The thought was a sharp, searing pain. She remembered a conversation with Ethan years ago when he was just starting to understand the concept of fairness. He'd asked why some kids had everything and others had so little. She had fumbled for an answer then, trying to explain the complexities of the world without crushing his nascent optimism. Now, she was living the harsh reality of that inequality, the bitter truth that kindness could be a scarce commodity, and its absence could lead to unforeseen and devastating consequences. As the judge prepared to deliver the verdict, the courtroom held its breath. This wasn't just a legal pronouncement. It was the final chapter of a story born of desperation, betrayal, and the profound, transformative power of a mother's love, a story that now demanded an answer, not just from the law, but from the conscience of everyone present. The courtroom held its breath, the air thick with the weight of expectation. The judge's voice, calm and measured, began to articulate the findings, each word falling with the solemnity of a final judgment. Amelia felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a scene unfold in a film rather than experiencing her own reality. Her gaze, however, remained fixed on David, a silent plea for acknowledgement, for understanding, for something more than the cold indifference she had faced so many years ago. He shifted in his seat, a subtle movement that spoke volumes, a rare tremor in his usually unshakable composure. Was it the gravity of the moment, or the subtle flicker of a long-buried memory resurfacing? The verdict came, delivered with the stark finality of justice. Guilty on certain charges, but with mitigating circumstances acknowledged. The judge spoke of the extraordinary pressures and the desperate circumstances that had influenced Amelia's actions, a small victory, a faint glimmer of understanding in the harsh glare of the law. The sentence, while still significant, was less severe than it could have been, a testament to the emotional testimony presented and the undeniable truth of her motive, a mother's fierce love. As the words registered, a wave of complex emotions washed over Amelia. Relief mixed with profound sorrow, a sense of vindication intertwined with the painful realization of the years she would now spend separated from Ethan. Then, something entirely unexpected happened. As the judge concluded and the courtroom began to stir, a voice cut through the rustle of papers and hushed murmurs. It was David. He stood, slowly, his usual rigid posture momentarily faltering. "Your Honor," he began, his voice surprisingly clear, though with a faint tremor. "May I say something?" The courtroom fell silent once more, all eyes now on him. His legal team exchanged bewildered glances, clearly not anticipating this deviation from their carefully orchestrated defense. David turned, not to the judge, but to Amelia, his eyes meeting hers for the first time with an undeniable, unmasked intensity. "Amelia," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with a regret that seemed to emanate from a deep, hidden place. "I remember that night. I remember your call. And I was wrong." The words hung in the air, echoing in the stunned silence. He continued, his voice gaining strength. "My refusal was driven by fear, by a misguided belief in cold business practices above human compassion. I prioritized profit, image, over a desperate plea from someone I once cared for. I never understood the depth of your struggle, the consequences of my indifference, until now. Watching this trial, seeing the truth of your desperation, the sacrifices you made for Ethan, it has opened my eyes. I can't undo the past, but I want to acknowledge my part in it. I am truly sorry, Amelia, for everything." The apology, raw and unfiltered, was a confession whispered from the depths of a long-hardened heart. It wasn't a legal defense, but a profoundly human admission, a moment of raw vulnerability that shattered the carefully constructed image he had maintained for so long. Amelia watched him, tears finally stinging her eyes, not tears of despair, but of a strange, unexpected release. It was an acknowledgement she hadn't known she craved, a validation of her pain, a small act of kindness in a world that had often seemed devoid of it. The courtroom, witnessing this extraordinary moment, remained silent, a collective gasp of understanding passing through the stunned onlookers. The courtroom remained in a stunned silence, the reverberations of David's apology hanging in the air, a raw, unexpected confession that had stripped away the layers of pretense from both him and the proceedings. For Amelia, it was a moment of profound, almost dizzying, clarity. The bitterness she had carried for so long, a heavy stone in her heart, seemed to lighten, if only infinitesimally. It didn't erase the years of struggle, the pain, or the imminent separation from Ethan, but it offered a measure of peace she hadn't dared to hope for. It was an acknowledgement, a validation of her pain, and a fleeting connection to a past that had once been filled with a different kind of hope. David, still standing, looked utterly drained, the mask of indifference finally shattered. He wasn't just a successful businessman anymore. He was a human being grappling with the weight of his own conscience, exposed for all to see. The judge, a seasoned veteran of countless trials, simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary human drama that had just unfolded in her courtroom. It was a moment that transcended legalities, a testament to the unpredictable turns of the human heart and the enduring power of truth, even when it arrived years too late. The legal proceedings drew to a close, the final pronouncements made, and Amelia was led away. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges, but as she walked, a new sensation settled within her, a fragile, nascent hope. David's apology, however belated, had planted a seed of possibility. It was a recognition that even in the darkest corners of human experience, compassion could find a way to break through, and that sometimes, the most profound transformations began not with grand gestures, but with the quiet courage to admit a mistake. After listening to this entire story, what are your thoughts on kindness, justice, and the unexpected ways they can intertwine?